Okay, squirrels, you that were on my unscheduled live that wanted some more. Here we go. And those who said in the comments, don't stop. Here we go with chapter 6. We puzzled over the business of the clock for some time, but we could make nothing of it. Griselda said I ought to make another effort to tell Inspector Slack about it. But on that point I was feeling what I can only describe as mulish. Inspector Slack had been abominably and most unnecessarily rude. And I said a word earlier, represented it or something. Didn't say that. It reminded me of something Joe had said. I was looking forward to a moment when I could produce my valuable contribution and effect his discomfiture. I would then say in a tone of mild reproach, if you had only listened to me, Inspector Slack. I expected that he would at least speak to me before he left the house, but to our surprise, we learned from Mary that he had departed, having locked up the study door and issued orders that no one was to attempt to enter the room. Griselda suggested going up to Old Hall. It will be so awful for Anne Prothero with the police and everything, she said. Perhaps I might be able to do something for her. I cordially approved of this plan, and Griselda set off with instructions that she was to telephone me if she thought that I could be of any use or comfort to either of the ladies. I now proceeded to ring up the Sunday school teachers who were coming at 7:45 for their weekly preparation class. I thought that under the circumstances it would be better to put them off. Dennis was the next person to arrive on the scene, having just returned from a tennis party. The fact that murder had taken place at the Vicarage seemed to afford him acute satisfaction. Fancy being right on the spot in a murder case, he exclaimed. I've always wanted to be right in the midst of one. Why have the police locked up the study? Wouldn't one of the other door keys fit it? I refused to allow anything of the sort to be attempted. Excuse me. Sinus drainage. Dennis gave in with a bad grace. After extracting every possible detail from me, he went out into the garden to look for footprints, remarking cheerfully that it was lucky it was only old Prothero, whom everyone disliked. His cheerful callousness rather grated on me, but I reflected that I was perhaps being hard on the boy. At Dennis's age, a detective story is one of the best things in life, and to find a real detective story, complete with corpse, waiting on one's own front doorstep, so to speak, is bound to send a healthy-minded boy into the seventh heaven of enjoyment. Death means very little to a boy of 16. Griselda came back in about an hour's time. She had seen Anne Prothero, having arrived just after the inspector had broken the news to her. On hearing that Mrs. Prothero had last seen her husband in the village about 5:45, and that she had no light of any kind to throw upon the matter, he had taken his departure, explaining he would return on the morrow for a fuller interview. He was quite decent in his way, said Griselda grudgingly. How did Mrs. Prothero take it? I asked. Well, she was very quiet, but then she always is. Yes, I said, I can't imagine Anne Prothero going into hysterics. Of course it was a great shock. You could see that. She thanked me for coming and said she was very grateful, but that there was nothing I could do. What about Lettice? Or Lettice? Lettice. She was out playing tennis somewhere. She hadn't got home yet. There was a pause, and then Griselda said, and Sandrine was talking on Kelly's still live. I hated to leave, but I wanted to get this done. Because Terry's going to go on live, and I will go back on my friend Kelly's. I was so tickled that the squirrels went over to my friend Kelly's. I know some of y'all know Kelly anyway, but the ones of y'all who didn't, I hope you've now found a new place to go on Tuesday nights at 7:05 Eastern Time. But Terry Modest is coming on for her very first live at 9 tonight, so I need to get finished. Oh, I was saying, Sandrine and Kelly were both talking about using, for their sinuses, oh, what is that stuff? I take it too. It's a nose spray. But it does, as nose sprays do, go down the back of your throat, and its taste is terrible. So they were talking about that. You know, Lynn, she was really very quiet, very queer indeed. The shock, I suggested. Yes, I suppose so. And yet, Griselda furrowed her brows perplexedly. It wasn't like that somehow. She didn't seem so much bowled over as well terrified. Terrified? Yes, not showing it, you know, at least not meaning to show it, but a queer watchful look in her eyes. I wonder if she has a sort of idea who did kill him. She asked again and again if anyone were suspected. Did she? I said thoughtfully, yes, of course. Anne's got marvelous self-control, but one could see that she was terribly upset. More so than I would have thought, for after all, it wasn't as though she were so devoted to him. I should have said she rather disliked him, if anything. Death alters one's feelings sometimes, I said. Yes, I suppose so. Dennis came in and was full of excitement over a footprint he had found in one of the flower beds. He was sure that the police had overlooked it, and that it would turn out to be the turning point of the mystery. I spent a troubled night. Dennis was up and about and out of the house long before breakfast to study the latest developments, as he said. Nevertheless, it was not he, but Mary, who brought us the morning's sensational bit of news. We had just sat down to breakfast when she burst into the room, her cheeks red and her eyes shining, and addressed us with her customary lack of ceremony. Would you believe it? The Bakers just told me they've arrested young Mr. Redding. Arrested Lawrence? Cried Griselda incredulously. Impossible. It must be some stupid mistake. No mistake about it, Mum, said Mary with a kind of gloating exultation. Mr. Redding, he went there himself and gave himself up last night, last thing. Went right in, threw down the pistol on the table, and I did it, he says, just like that. She looked at us both, nodded her head vigorously, and withdrew satisfaction with the effect she had produced. Griselda and I stared at each other. Oh, it isn't true, said Griselda. It can't be true. She noticed my silence and said, Lynn, you don't think it's true. I found it hard to answer her. I sat silent, the thoughts whirling through my head. He must be mad, said Griselda. Absolutely mad. Or do you think they were looking at the pistol together and it suddenly went off? That doesn't sound at all a likely thing to happen. But it must have been an accident of some kind, because there's not a shadow of a motive. What earthly reason could Lawrence have for killing Colonel Prothero? I could have answered that question very decidedly, but I wished to spare Anne Prothero as far as possible. There might still be a chance of keeping her name out of it. Remember, they had had a quarrel, I said. About Lettice and her bathing dress, yes, but that's absurd. And even if he and Lettice were engaged secretly, well, that's not a reason for killing her father. We don't know what the true facts of the case may be, Griselda. You do believe it, Lynn? Oh, how can you? I tell you, I'm sure Lawrence never touched a hair on his head. Remember, I met him just outside the gate. He looked like a madman. Yes, but, oh, it's impossible. There's the clock, too, I said. That explains the clock. Lawrence must have put it back to 6:20 with the idea of making an alibi for himself. Look how Inspector Slack fell into the trap. You're wrong, Lynn. Lawrence knew about that clock being fast, keeping the vicar up to time, he used to say. Lawrence would never have made the mistake of putting it back to 6:22. He'd have put the hand somewhere possible, like 6:45. He may have known what time Prothero got here, or he may have simply forgotten about the clock being fast. Griselda disagreed. No, if you were committing a murder, you'd be awfully careful about things like that. You don't know, my dear, I said mildly. You've never done one. Before Griselda could reply, a shadow fell across the breakfast table, and a very gentle voice said, I hope I'm not intruding. You must forgive me, but in the sad circumstances, the very sad circumstances, it was our neighbor, Miss Marple. I was wondering when she was coming in. Yay! Wish I could think of the name of that. I'll think of it. Accepting our polite disclaimer, she stepped in through the window, and I drew up a chair for her. She looked faintly flushed and quite excited. Very terrible, is it not? Poor Colonel Prothero, not a very pleasant man, perhaps, and not exactly popular, but it's nonetheless sad for that. And actually shot in the Vicarage study, I understand. I said that had indeed been the case, but the dear vicar was not here at the time. Mrs. Marple questioned of Griselda. I explained where I had been. Mr. Dennis is not with you this morning, said Miss Marple, glancing around. Dennis, said Griselda, fancies himself as an amateur detective. He's very excited about a footprint he found in one of the flower beds, and I fancy he's gone off to tell the police about it. Dear, dear, said Miss Marple, such a to-do, is it not? And Mr. Dennis thinks he knows who committed the crime. Well, I suppose we all think we know. You mean it's obvious? Said Griselda. No, dear, I didn't mean that at all. I dare say everyone thinks it's somebody different. That is why it's so important to have proofs. I, for instance, am quite convinced I know who did it. But I must admit I haven't one shadow of proof. One must, I know, be very careful of what one says at a time like this. Criminal libel, don't they call it? I've made up my mind to be most careful with Inspector Slack. He sent word he would come and see me this morning, but now he's just phoned up to say it won't be necessary after all. I suppose since the arrest it isn't necessary, I said. The arrest? Miss Marple leaned forward, her cheeks pink with excitement. I didn't know there'd been an arrest. It's so seldom that Miss Marple is worse informed than we are that I had taken it for granted that she would know the latest developments. It seems we have been talking at cross purposes, I said. Yes, there's been an arrest, Lawrence Redding. Lawrence Redding? Miss Marple seemed very surprised. Now I should not have thought, Griselda interrupted vehemently. I can't believe it even now. Not though he has actually confessed. Confessed? Said Miss Marple. You say he's confessed? Oh dear, I see I've been sadly at sea. Yes, sadly at sea. I can't help feeling it must have been some kind of an accident, said Griselda. Don't you think so, Lynn? I mean, his coming forward to give himself up looks like that. Miss Marple leaned forward eagerly. He gave himself up, you say? Yes. Oh, said Miss Marple with a deep sigh. I'm so glad, so very glad. I looked at her in some surprise. It shows a true state of remorse, I suppose, I said. Remorse? Miss Marple looked very surprised. Oh, but surely, dear Vicar, you don't think that he's guilty. It was my turn to stare, but since he's confessed... Yes, but that just proves it, doesn't it? I mean, that he has nothing to do with it. No, I said, I may be dense, but I can't see that it does. If you've not committed a murder, I cannot see the object of pretending you have. Oh, of course there's a reason, said Miss Marple. Naturally, there's always a reason, isn't there? And young men are so hot-headed and often prone to believe the worst. She turned to Griselda. Don't you agree with me, my dear? I don't know, said Griselda. It's difficult to know what to think. I can't see any reason for Lawrence behaving like a perfect idiot. If you'd seen his face last night, I began. Tell me, said Miss Marple. I described my homecoming while she listened intently. When I had finished, she said, I know that I'm very often rather foolish and don't take in things as I should, but I really do not see your point. It seems to me that if a young man had made up his mind to the great wickedness of taking a fellow creature's life, he would not appear distraught about it afterwards. It would be premeditated and cold-blooded. A premeditated and cold-blooded action, and though the murderer might be a little flurried and possibly might make some small mistake, I do not think it likely he would fall into a state of agitation, such as you describe. It's difficult to put oneself in such a position, but I cannot imagine getting into a state like that myself. We don't know the circumstances, I argued. If there was a quarrel, the shot may have been fired in a sudden gust of passion, and Lawrence might afterwards have been appalled at what he had done. Indeed, I prefer to think that this is what did actually occur. I know, dear Mr. Clement, that there are many ways we prefer to look at things, but one must actually take facts as they are, must one not? And it does not seem to me that the facts bear the interpretation you put upon them. Your maid distinctly stated that Mr. Redding was only in the house a couple of minutes, not long enough, surely, for a quarrel such as you describe. And then again, I understand the colonel was shot through the back of the head while he was writing a letter. At least that's what my maid told me. Quite true, said Griselda. He seems to have been writing a note to say he couldn't wait any longer. The note was dated 6:20, and the clock on the table was overturned and stopped at 6:22, and that's just what has been puzzling Lynn and myself so frightfully. Lordy, I wish I could remember the name of that stuff that's dripping down the back of my throat. It is a nasty taste. But it's supposed to dry you up. I guess I need some more. It's prescription. That's all I can think of. She explained our custom. It's after 9 o'clock. Of keeping the clock a quarter of an hour fast. Very curious, said Miss Marple. Very curious indeed. But the note seems to me even more curious still. I mean, She stopped and looked round. Lettice Prothero was standing outside the window. Lettice. She came in nodding to us and murmuring, "Morning." She dropped into a chair and said with rather more animation than usual, "They've arrested Lawrence, I hear." "Yes," said Griselda, "it's been a great shock to us." "I never really thought anyone would murder father," said Lettice. She was obviously taking a pride in letting no hint of distress or emotion escape her. "Lots of people wanted to, I'm sure. There are times when I'd have liked to have done it myself." "Won't you have something to eat or drink, Lettice?" asked Griselda. "No, thank you. I just drifted around to see if you'd got my beret here. A queer little yellow one. I think I left it in the study the other day." "If you did, it's there still," said Griselda. "Mary never tidies anything." "I'll go and see," said Lettice, rising. "Sorry to be such a bother, but I seem to have lost everything else in that hat line." "I'm afraid you can't get it now," I said. "Inspector Slack has locked the room up." "Oh, what a bore. Can't we get in through the window?" "I'm afraid not. It's latched on the inside." "Surely, Lettice, a yellow beret won't be much good to you at present." "You mean mourning and all that?" "I shan't bother about mourning. I think it's an awfully archaic idea. It's a nuisance about Lawrence. Yes, it's a nuisance." She got up and stood frowning abstractedly. "I suppose it's all on account of me in my bathing dress. So silly, the whole thing." Griselda opened her mouth to say something, but for some unexplained reason shut it again. A curious smile came to Lettice's lips. "I think so," she said softly. "I'll go home and tell Anne about Lawrence being arrested." She went out of the window again. Griselda turned to Miss Marple. "Why did you step on my foot?" The old lady was smiling. "I thought you were going to say something, my dear, and it's often so much better to let things develop on their own lines. I don't think you know that that child is half so vague as she pretends to be. She's got a very definite idea in her head, and she's acting upon it." Mary gave a loud knock on the dining room door and entered hard upon it. "What is it?" said Griselda. "And Mary, you must remember not to knock on doors. I've told you about it before." "Thought you might be busy," said Mary. "Colonel Melchett's in there, here. Wants to see the master." "Colonel Melchett is chief constable of the county." I rose at once. Or it could be Melchett, but it's C-H-E-T-T. "I thought you wouldn't like my leaving him in the house, so I put him in the drawing room," went on Mary. "Shall I clear?" "Not yet," said Griselda. "I'll ring." She turned to Miss Marple, and I left the room. And that's it. Which is great, because we got to get over to Terry Modis. It looks like Mayers. M-A-R-E-S. T-E-R-R-I, Terry Modis. But it's spelled M-A-R-E-S, crochet, I think. So, that leaves us at chapter 7. So, I hope y'all like that. That was a long one. Sorry about all the harking and hacking. So I gotta go take some more of that. Whatever it is, I can't think of the name of. Thank you, Crochet Rocks, for the beautiful. Almost too pretty to wipe my snots on. Okay, I'll see y'all over at Terry's. Be sweet, don't be ugly. Love ya. Night.